brothers and sisters, it's been an interesting week since we last spoke. 3 days before America celebrated its 248th birthday, the Supreme Court abolished democracy in the U.S. by making the president a king. Convicted felon Donald J. Trump's sentencing, set earlier for the 11th of this month, has been postponed. And the Facebook friend on whose behalf I expended some effort in the form of last week's Sunday school lesson, quite a few hours of research, writing, and editing, as is surely apparent from what I posted, seems not to have watched a minute of it. That would be his pattern. There's a trollish dimension to his personality. So let's just say that from this point, I'm no longer teaching this series of Sunday school lessons for his benefit, if that was ever the case in the first place. I've caught the bug, as I have from time to time in the past, and plan to continue as long as this remains enjoyable. Last week, in the first installment of a response to a Kent Hovind creation seminar, we heard Dr. Dino's summary of carbon-14 generation in the upper atmosphere, and now he's going to cast doubt on its efficacy as a tool for establishing the ages of things. I'll try to get through 5 or 6 minutes of this thing in this installment. I wish I could promise that things will go more quickly now since I laid some groundwork earlier, but unfortunately the tempo of Hovind's lies only accelerates from this point. And it's always the case that it takes far more time to refute his bogus claims than it takes for him to make them. He's the embodiment of the Gish Gallop. He's about to summarize the imperative of the weak nuclear force in colorful metaphorical language, so let's hear the good doctor out so that we can get on with his argument against its application.
So it still weighs as much as the nitrogen, but now it's considered a carbon. It's called radioactive, which does not mean it listens to the radio. It's just, it's unstable, and it's going to break apart. It's like 3 guys dating the same girl. That relationship's not going to last, okay, forever. Something will go wrong, right? Find the one you want, Jonathan, and just marry her and be happy the rest of your life, right? Carbon-14 is unstable. It does not like being carbon-14. It wants to get out of this situation, so it breaks down.
Anthropomorphizing really isn't a very promising way to go, but I can understand its appeal to Dr. Dino's audience, since they all worship an anthropomorphic deity and don't think twice about ascribing omnipresence and invisibility to it. It's from this point that Kent is going to argue that what he calls carbon dating is unreliable. I'll just remind you that radiocarbon dating has no application to the age of fossils, which typically contain no carbon. But since he insists on collapsing all radiometric dating tools into the single category of carbon dating, I guess we'll just have to expect that and let him have his say on his own terms.
About half of it will break down on a statistical average. About half of it is going to fall apart every 5,700 years. Now, it is doing this on a purely random procedure. I mean, you got a pile of molecules. You never know which one's going to fall apart. But statistics tell us about half of them will fall apart every 5,700 years, roughly.
When did molecules enter the picture? I thought we were talking about radioactive decay. That doesn't apply to molecules. Kent, are you sure you taught high school science for 15 years?
Now, while it is carbon-14, it's floating around in the atmosphere, like the rest of the carbon. And it latches onto oxygen, like carbon often does, and becomes carbon dioxide. And they hook up, and they're happily floating around the atmosphere. And the plants are breathing in CO2. Animals come along and eat the plants. So the only way carbon-14 gets into the living world is from the atmosphere. It's produced by the sun, striking the atmosphere. Plants breathe it in. Animals eat the plants.
Well, that explanatory account had more holes in it than the ones even I have been known to spin, and this from the guy who was bragging earlier about his knack for making things simple enough for a 4th grader to understand. But I'm going to grant his explanation as essentially correct, the awful analogies and gaping lacunae notwithstanding, and underscore one of the features of that explanation. The only way 14C gets into the living world, he said, is through photosynthesis in plants and by plants being eaten by animals. But what about the non-living world? That's going to come up later, so you'll want to hold this in mind.
Probably during your lifetime, you've either eaten plants or you've eaten animals that have eaten plants. How many have ever done that before? Like today for lunch, right? Okay. Everything we do is from one of those two sources. It's plants or it's animals that ate plants. Well, the plants are absorbing CO2. Some of it is radioactive. So if the atmosphere contains 0.0000765%, it is assumed that the plants also have 0.0000765%. Probably a reasonable assumption, and I don't argue with them. I just point out this is one of dozens of assumptions that can enter in to really mess up things like carbon dating.
Kent just poisoned the well by dropping that little turd-shaped comment about assumptions into it. And since he's in the habit of using that word as an accusation, I think it's important to do some differentiating. Assumption, a word my own use of which I underscored in last week's lesson, is a word with range. In meaning, it can extend all the way from the completely harebrained, I assume you're a pedophile since you voted for Hillary, to the all but certain, I assume you took a leak sometime today. That last is a safe assumption, isn't it? I didn't see you take a leak, but it's reasonably certain that you did, isn't it? The assumptions of science are safe assumptions. They're all but certainties. For instance, there's no reason to think that the fundamental forces of the universe have undergone any changes since the emergence of our current universe from the singularity that mathematics seems to predict. The assumptions of science are also known as the natural laws of the universe. Let's not mistake what Kent is trying to do here. He's trying to make science look as bad as religion by accusing it of the same epistemological felonies that religion is guilty of. Let's also not lose sight of the fact that his ridicule of scientific assumptions is meant to stand in high contrast to his certainty regarding the so-called sacred scriptures of Christianity, the unchanging truth revealed to ancient goat herds who thought that diseases were caused by demons and that you could get striped calves by having your cattle face a picket fence while copulating.
So probably you have 0.0000765% carbon in you.
Carbon-14, he meant to say. And that's a safe assumption. Go on.
Because you've been eating these plants or you've been eating the animals that have eaten the plants. So probably it's all balanced in nature. When the plant or animal dies, it stops eating, stops taking in more C14, it stops breathing.
The cessation of 14C intake at death is not because you stopped breathing, Dr. Hovind. That's not how we got it into our bodies in the first place. Any 14C that's inhaled is hitching a ride in a CO2 molecule, and that's going to be expelled in the next exhalation. It's the cessation of eating that causes the cessation of 14C intake. And in this connection, it's not accurate to say that plants are breathing in the first place. That's poetic language, and certainly permissible as such, but it does not accurately describe the process. Science teacher my ass. I'm just a music teacher, and even I know these things.
Okay? Now, whatever it had is going to decay. It was decaying while it was alive, but now there's nothing to replace it. So what they do is they compare the amount of C14 in the fossil with the amount in the atmosphere and say, wow, this fossil's only got half as much. Therefore, it's been dead for one half-life, 5,700 years.
His illustrations are so nonsensical that it makes me wonder if he's ever read anything about fossil formation. I wonder if he knows how absurd the idea of a 5,700-year-old fossil is in the first place. I wonder if he knows there's a whole suite of time-consuming taphonomic processes that lies between the death of a plant or animal and its fossilization that render his entire argument about 14C, whatever that argument is, completely moot. Those taphonomic processes result in the replacement of the original carbon by silicate, carbonate, sulfide, or phosphate minerals. Radiocarbon dating has no application here. Why does he persist in insisting that it does? Because he makes his living gaslighting his audience, that's why.
Because it continues to decay after it died, but now it can't be replaced. So while it was alive, it should have had about 0.0000765%. If it's only got 0.0003825%, it's been dead for one half-life, or two half-lives, or three half-lives, etc. In theory, it never goes to zero. But for practical purposes, you can't measure beyond a certain amount. You know, you're going to run out of stuff to measure. It goes from a half to a fourth to an eighth to a 16th to not enough to measure.
I honestly can't figure out why he's even bothering to try to explain this, since he reckons the whole godless universe to be about 6,000 years old, and radioactive decay rates can't possibly have any light to shed on that. Most radioactive decay hasn't even had time to really get underway. There should be almost no lead at all on this 6,000-year-old planet. By his young Earth creationist lights, we should never find a fossil specimen that includes any less than half its original 14C content. Incidentally, you may have noticed a bookcase behind me that's got a lot of plastic cases and cardboard beer cartons in it, and next to it a couple of old kitchen drawers that I commandeered for that same purpose. Those cases are filled with fossils, most of them Paleozoic marine fossils whose ages date all the way from the Middle Ordovician to the late Permian. I've been collecting and cataloging them for years. Not a single one of them contains a bit of carbon other than the carbon that's locked in the carbonate mineral known as calcite, which has in most cases replaced the organic carbon that the animals were originally made of. Radiocarbon dating has no application in calcite other than the dating of such speleothems as stalactites, stalagmites, columns, and other flowstone formations in limestone caves, and even there, that application is quite limited. The ages of all those Paleozoic marine fossils were established by other means that I synopsized for you in last week's Sunday school lesson. In case you don't remember it, it has to do with the dating of igneous rocks found in connection with sedimentary rocks. Radiocarbon dating is not one of the tools used to establish the age of igneous rocks.
Great article came out from Institute for Creation Research. They're the ones that did the RATE project, ICR.org. They said, with their short 5,700-year half-life, no carbon-14 atoms should exist in any carbon older than 250,000 years. They should all be gone. Yet it's proven impossible to find any natural source of carbon below the Ice Age that does not contain significant amounts of carbon-14. Even though such strata are supposed to be millions or billions of years old, conventional carbon-14 laboratories have been aware of this anomaly since the early 80s and have striven to eliminate it and are unable to account for it. Lately, the world's best such laboratory, which has learned during 2 decades of low C14 measurements how not to contaminate specimens externally, under contract to creationists, they confirmed such observations for coal samples and even for a dozen diamonds. I think what that means.
Oh, I'm thinking about it all right, and I'd recommend that Kent do the same. I alluded to this a few minutes ago when I stressed his own language about 14C entering the living world only through photosynthesis and herbivory. But what about the non-living world, I asked at the time, and here we are, and here's the explanation. One of the most common contaminants, let's call them, in the Earth's crust is nitrogen. This shouldn't be surprising since the atmosphere is dominated by it. It even shows up in diamonds, which more often than not include impurities. Both coal beds and the kimberlite and lamproite dikes in which diamonds are found are also surrounded by radioactive materials, including, for instance, such naturally occurring radioactive minerals as biotite and hornblende in granite. The effect of alpha decay at short range is like that of cosmic rays striking nitrogen in the upper atmosphere. That's how you get measurable amounts of carbon-14 in coal seams and diamonds. It's certainly not because the Earth is less than 10,000 years old.
The textbooks will tell you coal formed 250 million years ago in the Carboniferous era. And yet when they test coal, it still has carbon-14.
Kent's information is at least 50 years out of date, and that's just the part he sort of got right. The majority of coal was laid down in the Carboniferous period, not era, but such fine distinctions don't matter to this clown since he thinks the entire sedimentary cover was deposited by Noah's flood. But the Carboniferous extended from 299 to 359 million years ago. And there's also coal from most other geologic periods as well. In fact, during the Carboniferous and Permian periods, roughly 90% of the planet's coal was laid down, but that still leaves 10% for the rest of time since then. Coal has been and is being produced wherever and whenever there have been forested swamps.
How is that possible? If all the carbon-14 atoms would have disappeared in, say, 30, 40, 50,000 years, why would there still be carbon-14 atoms in coal?
I believe I already addressed that sufficiently. Here's Kent's alternative hypothesis.
I got an idea. It's not 250,000 years old. Ooh, boy, they don't like that answer. They'll keep searching until they find another answer because they don't like that one for sure.
They don't like it because it's wrong. A wrong answer is worse than no answer at all.
And diamonds, which they say, formed millions and millions of years ago, they still have carbon-14 in them. And it's not possible to contaminate one of those things. I mean, that's the hardest substance we have. So how do you get carbon-14 in diamonds?
I believe I've already explained that. But to clarify, just because diamonds are the hardest minerals on Earth doesn't mean that they're impenetrable by high-energy decay products from nearby igneous rocks that include uranium locked in their minerals.
And when did diamonds form? Well, I'm not sure when they formed. I know Superman makes them in a few minutes. Take a piece of coal, squeeze it, he's got a diamond to give to, what's their name, but olive oil.
That would be about Kent's level of understanding. Fun fact, diamonds are not, cannot be, formed by compressing coal. Diamonds are formed in the Earth's mantle from the compression under unimaginably high temperatures of carbonate material from the seafloor riding subducting tectonic plates. That carbonate material, the remains of ancient shells and hard body parts of marine animals mostly, is much closer to being pure carbon than any coal ever could be. Remarkably enough, the softest and hardest minerals on Earth are both pure carbon. There must be a God, right? Actually, the difference is due to the type of molecular bonding involved, simple versus covalent. I'll bet this science teacher knows all about those things.
And so, they've learned today, just in the last 20 years, I guess, how to make diamonds that are just indistinguishable from natural diamonds. High pressure. They've been doing it for years, making artificial diamonds, but they can't get them very big. Now, I think in 2005, they were able to get big diamonds with a synthetic process.
Did you notice that he never bothered to say what material the diamond synthesizers were starting with? As though that's not important. But Kent's not interested in informing anyone. He's set on baffling his audience with a bunch of aimless but knowledgeable-sounding twaddle and specious arguments, thus reassuring them that they're in possession of the ultimate truth while pretending that he knows the science that justifies their faith. It's pitiful. It's an echo chamber, like where the MAGAs live, most of whom believe this stuff. Now there's an inaudible question from a member of Kent's enlightened audience, and from Kent's response, I think we can deduce the nature of that question.
Do it with pets and loved ones.
Take your pet, that's right. Burn the body, cremate it, press right into a diamond. And you can wear your dog the rest of your life, something, or your ex-wife, or whatever. I don't think I'd want to do that. We were talking about that on the radio yesterday.
Let the horror wash over you, brothers and sisters.
Anyway, the guy said these diamonds even have carbon-14. It says this cannot be contaminated. Those constitute very strong evidence the Earth is only thousands, not billions of years old. Now, the Rate Project book is difficult reading, heavy reading. Jonathan, you're awful smart. How far did you make it through the book?
About halfway right now.
About halfway, and it's taken you almost a year. Yeah, it's heavy reading. If you want the simplified, don't go down quite so deep version, this one is excellent by Donald DeYoung, Thousands, Not Billions. He kind of summarizes in real English what they said. Different ways to show, look, it's not billions of years old.
I won't be shelling out a penny to review that apologetic, but if it's really a simplified version of the tome he opened this lecture with, then you'll have access to that through a link I will again provide in the description below.
But the carbon dating assumptions need to be pointed out. They'll say, well, we know carbon decays at a certain rate, and so we know if it's only got half as much, it's half as old. There's some assumptions that mess up everything. I'll show you how it works.
This is presumably the thing that Kent was aiming at all along, his reasons why radiometric dating is an unreliable tool for establishing the age of anything older than the amount of time he thinks the world has existed. And he's about to give us another stellar example of dumbing it all down so the kids can get it. I'll address this one point by point, even though it's going to break the flow of the narrative pretty badly.
If I said, we're going to fill a barrel with water. So I hand Leah the hose. Here, Leah, fill this barrel with water. But what you don't know is I have drilled holes in the barrel. While you're putting it in, the water's leaking out. It's kind of like your checkbook. You know, you keep putting it in and it keeps leaking out someplace, right? How many discovered that as you live along? Got the ring, Jonathan? You're discovering now, right? Well, the Earth's atmosphere is kind of like this barrel. It's always getting brand new carbon-14, 21 pounds every year, being put in. And it's always leaking out through decay. So the question would be, how long would it take to reach a stage called equilibrium? Now with a barrel, you can actually do the math and calculate. If I'm going to put in, you know, a certain amount of water per minute and a certain amount per minute leaks out, when will I reach equilibrium and where? That can all be calculated, you know, with a little bit of math. And with the atmosphere, they said, well, when would the atmosphere reach equilibrium?
Beginning with zero? When was that ever a reality?
So the guys who invented carbon dating in the late 40s said, I wonder about this Earth's atmosphere reaching equilibrium. They did a bunch of studies on that and said, now if we took a brand new planet Earth.
Who are these they who did a bunch of studies? Have you ever noticed that he never cites his sources unless there's something he can glean from creationist propaganda? Go on, Kent. Tell us about this brand new planet Earth.
Created it from scratch. Poof, got it going around the sun.
Earth was not created, and poof is not the way it originated. Well, that's the way it happened according to that tall tale in Genesis 1, although that story has the sun created 4 days after the poofing of the earth into existence, so this just fails all around.
How long would it take to reach this equilibrium point in the atmosphere where the production rate and the destruction rate is the same?
Kent's question is nonsensical. He appears to be assuming a starting point of zero and wants to know how long it would take the C14 generating process I described last week to come into equilibrium with its decay on a newly poofed planet. That's not a model that any scientist is working with, but since he's working with it, I think it's fair to mention that by the testimony of his own sacred scripture, the process can't start until day 4 of the creation week, when God created a firmament, which is presumably equivalent to the atmosphere, and in any event, those emitters of cosmic rays known as the sun and stars won't be created until that day either. But for that matter, since by the sacred account God poofed the atmosphere into existence on day 4, presumably with the chemical constitution it has today, why not magic some 14C into existence right along with all the other gases that are being conjured out of nothing, abracadabra? Kent's analogy, clever as it is, doesn't really work because his starting assumption is all wrong.
And they determined it would take about 30,000 years to reach equilibrium. I'm not sure how they did all that. You could probably see some of the rate scientists and figure that out. But
there you have it. No citations, just an unsupported claim that he knows his audience will swallow because they think he's godly and smart and has a real doctoral degree.
Then they made 2 mistakes, in my totally unbiased opinion. They said, number 1, we know the Earth is millions of years old. Mistake number 1. Number 2, they said we can ignore the equilibrium problem because we would have passed that point 30,000 years ago.
Who's he talking about? Who are these people who are making these statements? They don't sound like scientists of any kind to me. They sound like creationists who are trying to imitate how they think scientists talk over cocktails and, of course, getting it all wrong.
You know, they've discovered the Earth has still not reached equilibrium. Radiocarbon is still forming 30 to 40% faster than it's decaying. Now think about that.
I'm thinking about it. And thanks to the University of Oklahoma libraries, I have that paper in front of me. I'll also make it available to you in the description below. I've read that paper. The quotation that Kent claims to have extracted from it appears nowhere in that paper. Look for yourself. Did he make it up? Why would he do that? Could it have anything to do with the fact that he knows no one in that audience is going to fact check him? Of course they aren't. He's confirming their biases. He's giving them more reasons to keep believing what they already want to believe. That gets them all tingly in their sensitive parts and keeps the donations rolling in. But let's be fair. He didn't make it up, but he didn't get it from the article he cited either. He got it from here. Here's the quote, highlighted. Notice there's a footnote. I wonder where that leads. Well, it leads to Brown, and as you can see from the footnote above it, Walt Brown is the author of In the Beginning, published in 2001. Since Kent will be referring to this very book near the end of his lecture, I think it's appropriate that we take a look at this author and his crowning intellectual masterpiece to finish out this week's Sunday school lesson. This is obviously a huge and perhaps unforgivable digression from my original plan, but since my Facebook friend seems not to be along for the ride, let's have some fun. Walt Brown is a mechanical engineer with a PhD from MIT, which makes it really hard to understand how he could possibly have imagined, much less continues to believe, his trippy hydroplate theory, one of the most absurd things I've encountered in my 74 years of life. Let's let Dr. Brown introduce his theory. If you're not already familiar with it, prepare to be amazed.
We can see on our planet many very strange features that can now be linked together and systematically explained as a result of a cataclysmic global flood whose waters erupted from subterranean chambers with an unimaginable amount of explosive energy. This explanation shows how major mountains formed very quickly. It explains our coal, oil, and methane deposits, rapid continental drift, why we find on the ocean floor huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and almost all fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were seas and rivers. The mountains were smaller than today, perhaps 5,000 feet high. According to the hydroplate theory, about half the water that is now in our oceans was originally contained in interconnected subterranean chambers. This water formed a thin spherical shell at least a mile thick, perhaps 60 miles below the surface of the pre-flood Earth. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 2 miles a second. This crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 3 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 60 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of this rupture. All along the globe-encircling crack, fountains of water jetted supersonically into and far above the atmosphere. The spray from this enormous fountain produced torrential rain such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day, and it describes these events about 5,000 years ago that we can now tie together scientifically in cause and effect order. Some of the water, jetting high above the stratosphere, froze into supercooled ice crystals and produced massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settled out of this muddy water all over the Earth. These sediments trapped and quickly buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Vegetation, uprooted by the floodwaters, accumulated in certain regions where it was buried and compressed, rapidly becoming our coal, oil, and methane deposits by processes we can duplicate in the laboratory today. Eventually, the rupture became so wide that the newly exposed compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like a seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of well over 60 miles an hour, they ran into resistances and, like a crashing continental-sized train, compressed, crushed, and buckled. As the continents crushed and thickened, they rose out of the floodwaters. The portions of the hydroplates that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled up formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. This also explains why today's continents do not have a jigsaw fit against each other, as so many textbooks mistakenly claim. Instead, the continents would fit much better against the sides of the mid-Atlantic ridge from where the continental drift began. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters eventually drained. This movement and the resulting compression and buckling was so cataclysmic that it occurred within a single day. Immediately after the flood, sea level was considerably lower than it is today, so land bridges connected every continent. This allowed people and animals to spread and repopulate the post-flood Earth. As the thickened continents slowly sank into the Earth's mantle, the new and very deep ocean floors had to rise in compensation for the downward flow of mass. Therefore, sea level slowly rose for a few centuries after the flood and eventually reached today's level. As sea levels rose, river channels were drowned, channels that had been cut down to the lowered sea level by the heavy drainage after the flood. This explains the famous submarine canyons that are extensions of our rivers such as the Amazon, the Congo, the Indus, the Hudson, and the Ganges. Because some submarine canyons are almost 3 miles below today's sea level, we can conclude that sea level and some seafloors were about 3 miles lower than today. The rising sea eventually flooded the natural bridges and produced the look of the continents as we see them today, separated by water. As the floodwaters drained off the continents, every continental basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes. Because of local conditions, some of these lakes simply dried up. Others continued to collect water from rainfall and drainage from higher elevations. Sometimes a large lake spilled over its rim at the lowest point, eroding a notch. If the rim wall was composed of sediments that were still soft, the escaping water quickly enlarged and deepened the notch. As the volume and speed of the rushing water increased, so did its eroding power, until the entire lake surged through a deep slit, forming a canyon. The largest canyon formed by this process is the Grand Canyon in Arizona. North and east of the Grand Canyon was a huge lake that I identified in 1987 and named Grand Lake. Grand Lake held twice the volume of water that is in Lake Michigan. Grand Lake spilled over its rim and carved this spectacular funnel 20 miles south of Page, Arizona, catastrophically forming the Grand Canyon within a few weeks and leaving a living testament to this terrible global flood, which can be studied in person today.
That sure stands 450 years worth of geology right on its head, doesn't it? And he said it all with a straight face. Makes you wonder how all those geologists working for the fossil fuel industry managed to find those coal, oil, and natural gas deposits, doesn't it? Brothers and sisters, as you've heard me say before, don't get your science from clowns like this. They aren't cutting-edge thinkers who are advancing science by challenging its suppositions and replacing them with better explanations. They're liars and grifters who feed on the credulity of vulnerable people who desperately want to believe the unbelievable. Do you remember the online source where Kent got his made-up quote? Do you know what the page All About Archaeology is promoting? Do you really suppose it's all about archaeology, which has nothing to do with geoscience, by the way? Look at the bottom of the page. Does that clear things up? Or better yet, open this page yourself and read their statement of faith. Here's the first paragraph. The sole basis of our beliefs is the Bible, God's infallible written word, the 66 books of the Old and New Testaments. We believe that it was uniquely, verbally, and fully inspired by the Holy Spirit, and that it was written without error in the original manuscripts. It is the supreme and final authority in all matters on which it speaks. Scientists don't publish statements of faith. Religious apologists do. Once again, I find my gag reflex tested almost to failure, so I believe I'll wrap up this week's Sunday School lesson with the promise to return next week to the point in Hovind's fire hose of lies where we left off today. Meanwhile, be of good cheer. Everything's temporary, and that, certainly in balance, is a good thing. Even if democracy is a casualty, at least we had a good run.